by the way, they're saying Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. No one's saying that. They're saying you have to obey you have to obey the commands of the Mosaic covenant. That's what the entire book of Galatians is about.
So why does Paul say my gospel in 1 Timothy and all that stuff? When he says my gospel, that's his God. That's not the disciples' gospel. It's his gospel. 1 Timothy, etc. So Paul says my gospel. That means it's his gospel, not the disciples' gospel. And you have the problem with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. People are preaching a different Jesus. Now
They were. There's a G.
Okay, so hang on.
This where you have to.
Okay, so now notice how David Wood ignores my point, because notice what I say. I say Paul was saying my gospel in Romans chapter 2 verse 16, in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 8, etc., etc. So Paul says like my gospel. Now notice what Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 8. He says, remember that Jesus Christ of the seed of David was raised from the dead according to my gospel. And so notice how Paul is saying that it's his gospel. The resurrection is his gospel. It's not the disciples' gospel, or he's not getting that information about Jesus' resurrection and death from the disciples. He's saying my gospel. That means Paul's own version of Jesus' death and resurrection, death for sins and resurrection. So now notice what. Now this is kind of like a death blow to the whole. Paul was preaching the same thing as the disciples, because Paul says that it's his gospel, right? So the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus is his gospel, according to 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 8. So the death and resurrection, it was preached by Paul and not Jesus. So David Wood completely. So Paul preached the resurrection of Christ as a means for salvation, etc., etc. So this is unique to Paul. This is not something he got from the disciples. So David Wood misses my point that this death and resurrection is coming from Paul, something I've repeated over and over and over in this debate or discussion, and Paul is not getting that information from the disciples. So I think 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 8 is kind of the death blow to Paul is preaching the same thing as the disciples. No, he says my gospel. That means his own version of what he thinks happens to Jesus, what he think happened to Jesus, that Jesus died and was resurrected. Paul is the one making things up, and he's not getting that information from the disciples. And I think David Wood missed this point. So this kind of confirms my view that this passage, 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 8, confirms my point that, or proves my point that Paul made up the death and resurrection of Jesus as a way to salvation, and this information didn't come from the disciples. It came from Paul's own revelations, as he admits in Galatians chapter 1 verses 11 to 12. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. That means Paul was getting that information, getting the death and resurrection, not from the disciples, but from his own revelation. So this proves that Paul made up the death and resurrection of Jesus, and he wasn't getting that from the disciples. So Paul, made up the death and resurrection of Jesus, not the disciples. If we were to go by 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 8, etc. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.